In the early 1970s, a unit formed within a United States federal law enforcement agency to examine the minds of several murderers and mass killers to attempt to understand their motives, their planning, and the way they chose their victims. This unit later became known as the Behavioral Sciences Unit of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. One of their first interviews took place with a killer so heinous and depraved that the interviewers believed him to be the key to understanding what makes most serial killers tick. Examining their pasts, what could cause a person to explode to the point of taking human life, defiling the victims' corpses, and then attributing their behavior to their upbringing. This is the story of one of those alpha killers that they interviewed, and the BSU believed important enough to warrant a serious study.
On April 23, 1973, the Santa Cruz Police Department received a telephone call from what appeared to be a payphone. The man, a 24-year-old, spoke on the telephone from Pueblo, Colorado, and confessed that he had just committed a double homicide 4 days earlier. The young man on the phone related that he killed his mother, Clarnell Strandberg, on Good Friday. Subsequent to murdering his mother, the young man went out and drank with some cop friends, and when he returned to his mother's residence, he invited her friend Sarah Sally Hallett over for dinner and a movie. When Hallett arrived at the residence, he murdered her too. The caller admitted that he removed Hallett's head and stuffed the bodies in closets located at his mother's residence on Ord Drive. The caller also related that when he left the house, he drove for days, dropped off one car, rented another, a green Chevy Impala, and then seriously contemplated turning himself in to authorities. In the conversation with the mysterious man, law enforcement listed he confessed to over half a dozen murders that police had still not solved. The caller requested that someone come and pick him up, as he had over 200 rounds of ammunition in the car, and that the cash frightened him. The first officer that took the call believed it to be a prank and refused to take the call seriously. The officer suggested that the caller try back again later, but when he did, the officer had a difficult time believing the man's story. The caller continued to call several more times after that, until finally he spoke to Officer Jim Connor, who knew the caller and convinced an officer to go check out his mother's house. When Junior Detective Michael Alufi arrived at the house and entered it, he immediately noticed the stench of decomposition. When he went to the part of the house where the caller stated he would find the bodies of his mother and her friend, Detective Alufi opened the door to the closet and saw a collection of blood and hair. He thereafter cordoned off the area and summoned the coroner, crime scene technicians, and other homicide detectives. The detectives and the coroner found the bodies of the two women exactly as the caller described over the telephone. Both the women had been decapitated, with the caller's mother's head, Clarnell Strandberg, having been placed on the mantel and used as a target for darts. Her tongue and larynx had been placed in the garbage disposal, which spit them back out into the sink. What investigators were drawn to happened to be the discovery of a bloody serial killer who lingered beneath the noses of the local police department. This murderer frequented a bar where most off-duty policemen in the area frequented as well. The policemen knew the identity of this killer because they drank with him and discussed aspects of the case that now came to light. The young man who had made the call and later would become the subject of an intense investigation was none other than Edmund Emil Ed Kemper III. Kemper had a long history of mental illness and had committed his first murder as a teenager, and what some would say was a justifiable homicide of his mother when his upbringing faced closer scrutiny. Ed Kemper was born in Burbank, California on December 18, 1948. Ed was the second child of Edmund Emil Kemper Jr. and Clarnell Kemper. Ed had a sister 6 years older and a sister 2.5 years younger than he was. When Kemper reached 9 years old, his father divorced his mother and she moved with the children to Montana. This move proved difficult for Kemper, as he grew very close to his father before the divorce. And once they arrived in Montana, Clarnell locked her son in the basement of the house any chance she could, in an attempt to toughen him up, so to speak. But in later interviews, Kemper gave other reasons for his mother's zeal to incarcerate him within the house. Kemper believed that his existence was a prickly reminder to his mother. Kemper hated his mother, but in interviews he has also stated that he loved her as well. He's stated as saying, "I still love my mother, and it's hard for someone to comprehend that you murder your mother through love. It isn't a rational process. It's a very painful process, and it isn't rational, and I gotta still live with that." Kemper somewhat understood his mother's motives and behavior, but he still experienced a great deal of misery and anger against her, and often envisioned things he would do to her. Although his life at home deteriorated the older he became, Kemper managed to present a pleasant facade in public, where people saw that even though he stood 6'9" and weighed over 280 pounds, people granted him a certain modicum of trust. Even though he acted quite docile in front of others, deep inside of Kemper's psyche, he developed perverse and demented fantasies. At a young age, approximately 10 years old, Kemper began thinking of females through sexual fantasies. His inner world soon reeked of violence, depravity, and morbidity. After imagining what he would do to his mother for her treatment of him, at the age of 13, Kemper began his morbid career when he murdered the family cat. This, Kemper later recalled, brought him a sense of empowerment, especially when he made an altar and placed the cat's decapitated head upon it. Also at this age, Kemper ran away from home to go live with his father, a life he thought sure would be better than living with his mother. But when he arrived at his father's residence, he discovered that his father had remarried and had had another son with his new wife. Needless to say, his father was not as happy to see him as much as Kemper would have thought. Although Edmund M.L. Kemper Jr. welcomed his son for a while, he soon sent Kemper back to his mother to live. Unable to deal with such an overgrown adolescent, and also planning to remarry her third husband, Clarnell sent her son to live with her parents in California. Later, Kemper stated that his father actually sent him to the grandparents to live with the intention of righting all the bad things his mother did to him. It seemed that Kemper became a sick pawn in a game of who's the better role model within the family. On August 27, 1964, 15-year-old Kemper lived with his paternal grandparents on their 17-acre ranch in North Fork, California. At this time, Kemper's rage boiled within him, thinking that he had somehow become the black sheep of the Kemper clan. Already standing 6'4" at his young age, Kemper presented an imposing figure on anyone that met him. He hated how his mother treated him, and his grandmother proved almost as difficult. It was here that his darkest fantasies took shape, as he grew tired of his grandmother also telling him what to do and when to do it. Kemper later recounted how he used to fantasize about killing his grandparents, and the rest of the world to be more specific. He wanted to rid the world of the people that had emasculated him. As he and his grandmother Maud sat in the kitchen going over proofs for a children's book that Maud had written, when she looked at her grandson, she noticed an odd yet diabolical look on his face. Kemper then grabbed a loaded rifle and told his grandmother that he was going outside to shoot some gophers. When his grandmother sternly warned him not to shoot birds, Kemper then walked outside the kitchen area, slamming the screen door behind him. When he got to the last step outside the door, he turned, and noticing her back to him, Kemper took aim with the rifle. He fired one shot, hitting her in the head, and killed her outright. He then placed 2 more shots in her back, then grabbed a knife and stabbed her repeatedly. When he returned to the inside of the house, Kemper wrapped her head in a towel and then dragged her corpse into her bedroom. As he situated his grandmother's body, he heard his grandfather's vehicle coming up the driveway. When Edmund Kemper Sr. arrived home after purchasing some groceries, Kemper took aim at the old man's head and pulled the trigger, also killing him outright. After these murders, Kemper became scared and wondered what to do with the bodies of his grandparents. Certainly they would be missed by family and friends, so he called his mother and she instructed him to call the local sheriff. When law enforcement arrived, they took Kemper to the station where he promptly confessed to the murders of his grandparents, stating that he often fantasized about murdering his grandmother, but only murdered his grandfather as an act of mercy, to keep him from having to see his dead wife and possibly die of a heart attack. As a result of his confession, California officials confined Kemper to the California Youth Facility until they could figure out what to do with him. Subsequently, a psychiatrist evaluated the young murderer and determined that he was paranoid and psychotic. Thereafter, the court confined Kemper to the Atascadero State Hospital on December 6, 1964, just 2 weeks shy of his 16th birthday. At Atascadero, it was not like a prison. There were no guard towers, and when Kemper arrived, the staff subjected him to a number of tests, and then he began to gain some insight as to why he killed. Kemper did not accept responsibility for his crimes, and believed that something else controlled him at the time of the commission of those crimes. Kemper participated in the training of assisting the staff at the institution into administering tests to other inmates. Normally, sociopaths, as determined through his tests as well, are not too eager to please anyone, much less perform a given task with the vision of being praised for competence. Kemper, on the other hand, wanted to please his administrators. Whether this served as a ploy for him to gain early release or not, Kemper showed concern for the tasks given to him by the staff of the hospital. Despite his model patient demeanor, Kemper's incarceration at Atascadero State Hospital was a very detrimental and harmful environment for a young teenage boy to be immersed in. Dr. William Schanberger, one of the facility's staff, has stated in interviews, "In those days we had 1,600 patients in the hospital, several dozen who had committed murder, and 800 mentally disordered sex offenders, and a psychology staff of only 10 people or so." While in Atascadero, Kemper conversed with teenage serial rapists, and in lengthy discourse with these boys, he developed a proclivity toward domination and violence, some of the facets that emerged when he committed later crimes. Kemper made mental notes that some of these rapists got caught due to their sloppiness in committing the crimes. They left the witnesses and overt evidence. They attacked women they already knew or acquainted, and they committed their crimes in places that were too public. Although Kemper maintained this information for further reference, he never informed therapists or psychiatrists that he actually had these types of violent fantasies. During the time of his incarceration, many believe that Kemper fashioned a plateaued religious conversion to trick the administrators and the court to release him from Atascadero. Viewed as clean-cut and conservative, intelligent and somewhat naive, Kemper saw his release in 1969, but it had been 5 years since his incarceration began, and assuredly the outside world changed rather abruptly for Kemper. Upon his release, Kemper started attending a local community college with an eye towards becoming a police officer, but while he attended the college, the youth authorities still maintained supervision over him. Although Kemper dreamed of himself to become a police officer with minimum height requirements, they also had maximum height requirements, of which Kemper exceeded. Because he faced the rejection from becoming a police officer, Kemper bought a motorcycle, which made him feel like a law enforcement officer. Kemper exceeded at his studies, and the state of California paroled him for another 18 months. Against the advice of the doctors at Atascadero that Kemper not return to the sponsorship of his mother, who by now had moved to Santa Cruz, California, and had again been married and divorced, the youth authority did exactly that. When Kemper returned to his mother's residence, the fighting and arguments soon began again. Clarnell harangued Kemper in such trivial matters as to whether to get his teeth cleaned or not. The constant nagging and belittlement made for an explosive atmosphere. Still fascinated with law enforcement work, Kemper sought solace at a local bar called the Jury Room. The lounge became a main hangout for local cops in the area, and Kemper sat drinking and listening to tales of the crime world through the eyes of these lawmen. Kemper showed respect to the officers who called him Big Ed. After wondering what was in store for his future, Kemper worked various labor jobs until finally he took a job with the California Division of Highways, which gave him the freedom to save some money and to move from his mother's house into an apartment in Alameda, California. Even though he no longer stayed under the same roof as his tormentor, Clarnell still berated her son whenever the chance arose. While riding his motorcycle, Kemper actually wrecked it twice, and the second time he badly broke his arm. The Division of Highways gave him time off to recover after this second accident, and with an out-of-court settlement from that mishap, he purchased a vehicle that resembled an unmarked police car. With this vehicle, Kemper equipped the car with a radio, an antenna, and a microphone to make outward appearances seem him to be a law enforcement officer. With this vehicle, Kemper picked up hitchhikers and brought them to their destinations unharmed. He learned during the course of these actions how to gain their trust. Privately, Kemper acted out his violent fantasies as to what he would do with the captive hitchhikers once he got them into the vehicle. Thereafter, Kemper further equipped his car to fulfill those fantasies within the future. He rigged the passenger side door, preventing it from opening from the inside. The antenna came off the vehicle and placed plastic bags, knives, guns, and a blanket. For over a year, Kemper experimented until the right time when he could finally encompass himself in the fantasies. On May 7, 1972, that circumstance presented itself. Two young girls, Marianne Pesci and Anita Lucchesa, attended Fresno State College and hitchhiked to Stanford University after spending a few days at Berkeley, California. Kemper felt that this incident was the right time. Soon after picking up the two young girls, he drove around a bit and finally pulled off to a secluded spot and pulled a pistol from under his seat. Kemper put Anita into the trunk and then concentrated on Marianne. Kemper handcuffed the terrified young woman, laid out in the back seat, put a plastic bag over her head, and tried to strangle her with a piece of terry cloth. But the young woman, fighting for her life, bit through the plastic bag, and the cloth suddenly snapped. Always the planner, Kemper took out a knife and began stabbing the young woman to death, finally just slashing her throat. Kemper then removed Anita from the trunk and with a larger knife began stabbing her as well. Anita fought and screamed, but Kemper eventually subdued her. After murdering the two young women, Kemper drove around in his car trying to decide what to do with their bodies. Kemper finally decided to bring Marianne's body to his apartment. Kemper undressed the body and systematically dissected her remains. He then decapitated Anita's body. Subsequently, Kemper buried Marianne in the plastic bag that she bit through while Kemper tried to murder her. Later, after his arrest, Kemper led police to Marianne's burial site. He kept the heads of the two girls for a long time, eventually throwing them into a ravine. Marianne's body would later be identified, but Anita's body, nor her head, would ever be found. Because of his quote-unquote square demeanor, no one would ever suspect Kemper of two brutal murders. Therefore, he continued to hunt. On the evening of September 14, 1972, Aiko Koo, a 15-year-old dancer of Korean descent, grew tired of waiting for a bus to her dance class and decided to hitchhike. Kemper happened by and picked her up. A few minutes passed in idle conversation, and then Kemper brandished a pistol in front of Aiko. When he said he was thinking about using the weapon on himself, Aiko caught on and knew he had no intention of killing himself. Kemper convinced her that he was not going to use the weapon on her either, but if she alerted anyone, he would kill her. Kemper then drove to the base of a mountain range and turned the vehicle onto a deserted path. Kemper then placed tape over her mouth and began suffocating her by placing his fingers in her nose and mouth. Aiko merely passed out, but when she regained consciousness, Kemper then tried the suffocation technique again and didn't stop until she quit breathing completely. Kemper then removed Aiko from the car and placed her lifeless body on the ground and raped her. He took her scarf and completed his suffocation of the 15-year-old. When he finished, Kemper placed her body in the trunk and drove away from the scene. Kemper made his way to a local bar and had a few beers before heading home. When he arrived at his residence, Kemper opened the trunk frequently to admire what he called his conquest. Later, when night fell, Kemper took Aiku's body and placed it upon his bed, dissecting parts from her corpse and then finally decapitating her. Subsequently, he deposited the various parts in different locations, and to this day, Aikoku's total remains have never been located. On January 8, 1973, Kemper purchased a .22 caliber revolver. He was not supposed to have or even be able to purchase it due to his previous crime and record. But Kemper had no problems with the purchase at all. At this point, his hunting intensified. On the same day as he purchased the revolver, Kemper picked up Cindy Shaw and drove into the woods near Watsonville, California, where he forced the young girl into the trunk of his car and shot her using his new firearm. Just prior to this assault, Kemper had moved back into his mother's house, so he brought Cindy's body back to the duplex where he presently lived, and when his mother left for work the following morning, Kemper had sex with Shaw's corpse. Painstakingly, Kemper dissected Cindy Shaw's corpse, paying close attention to taking the bullet out of her skull, disposing of that evidence, and then taking the dismembered parts of her body and throwing them over a cliff. Cindy Shaw's body had been discovered 24 hours after Kemper dismembered her, but he exhibited no fear of apprehension. On the night of February 5, 1973, Kemper and Clarnell had one of their monumental arguments, and Kemper stormed out of the apartment, hyped, excited, and ready to kill. Driving around, he spotted Rosalind Thorpe hitchhiking and decided to pick her up. For a short period of time, Kemper made small talk with Rosalind, and then picked up another young woman a few minutes later, Alice Liu. Kemper exhibited no hesitation when it came to having both women in his car, as there was a parking decal from the University of California, Santa Cruz, displayed prominently on the passenger side front windshield. Clarnell, his mother, had obtained the decal because she was employed by the university and worked on campus as an administrator. He figured that someone who may have portrayed himself as a hardworking student could not be that bad. Kemper drove for a short distance down the highway and drew Rosalind's attention toward the view of the passenger window. He then took out his .22 revolver and shot her in the back of the head as she admired the scenery at night. Kemper then turned toward the back seat and fired several rounds into Alice Liu, who didn't appear to die as quickly as Rosalind. Kemper waited until he got out of town to administer the coup de grace, finishing Alice off with an additional shot to the head. After pulling into a cul-de-sac, Kemper quickly placed their bodies into the trunk and drove to a local gas station. From the gas station, he returned to his mother's apartment, then quickly left again, claiming he needed cigarettes. When he left the apartment, Kemper went out to the car and decapitated the two bodies he had in the trunk. The next morning, he brought Alice's body into his room and had sex with it. He also removed the bullet from Rosalind. The killer then disposed of the body parts in the Pacific Ocean. Clarnell Stramberg never gave any indication that she knew as to her son's nocturnal activities. However, after murdering Rosalind Thorpe and Alice Liu, Kemper decided that it was time to finally eliminate his mother. On April 21, 1973, Kemper heard his mother return home after a night out partying with her friends. When he went into Clarnell's room, she stated to him, "Well, I suppose you want to talk now." Kemper shook his head and went to his room. He waited patiently there until approximately 5:15 a.m. when he went to the kitchen and retrieved a claw hammer. He walked into his mother's bedroom where she lay sleeping peacefully. Kemper raised his arm with the implement and struck his mother hard on the head. He finished off by slashing her throat. It is said that Kemper murdered and then decapitated his mother within a minute of the initial blow to her head. He then commenced to cutting out her larynx at the same time. The assailant then tried to stuff the tissue down the garbage disposal, but it only spit the tissue back up. He placed her head on the mantel and began speaking to her, telling her all the things she had done wrong with him. Kemper also threw darts for the first time, using his mother's decapitated head as a target. He then hid his mother's body in a closet, then soon left the apartment. In a later interview, Kemper found it hard to talk about the death of his mother, as her death was the result of the way she raised him. As he drove around that afternoon trying to decide what to do next, Kemper decided that if someone else were found with his mother's body, then suspicion would be cast away from his direction. Kemper got on the telephone and called Sarah Hallett, a friend of Clarnell's. At first, Kemper could not get in touch with her, and he teetered on the verge of panic until Sarah called later that afternoon, and he invited her over for dinner as a surprise for his mother. Sarah willingly accepted, and when she arrived at the apartment, Kemper strangled her with his bare hands, at first, and then used the scarf that he got from Coed to finish the job. After strangling Sarah to death, Kemper undressed the body, laid it on his bed, and attempted to have sex with her. He stayed the whole night in the apartment with the corpses of his mother and her friend, with blood strewn all over the place. On the following morning, Kemper left town driving east in Sarah's car, listening to the radio and perhaps hoping someone had gone to his mother's apartment and found the two corpses, but no announcement came over the airwaves. Scared that he may be detected, he rented another car and then left Sarah's vehicle at a local gas station, telling the attendant that it was in need of some repair. The killer then drove for 18 hours, only stopping for gas, soda, and no-dose, a caffeine compound promoted to keep those taking the pills awake. Kemper finally arrived in Pueblo, Colorado, and decided to turn himself in, although, as earlier documentation suggests, the police in Santa Cruz did not believe him at first. Subsequent to be taken into custody, Santa Cruz detectives immediately went to Pueblo, Colorado, where they questioned Kemper for hours as to the crimes he claimed to have committed. The killer gave very explicit details to the crimes he perpetuated and bestowed upon the investigators a very precise confession to the 8 murders he committed in or near Santa Cruz, California. When law enforcement authorities returned Ed Kemper back to Santa Cruz, he showed them the places where he dumped the bodies and body parts, all the while continuing to confess. When Kemper finished explaining everything to police, his court-appointed attorney, Jim Jackson, could find no other defense other than insanity. Finally, on May 7, 1973, Santa Cruz County indicted Kemper on 8 counts of first-degree murder. Several witnesses stepped forward at his trial to avert that Kemper was not capable of such violence, but the prosecutor at the time torpedoed the witnesses brought before the court. One prosecution witness, Dr. Joel Fort, testified that he reviewed Kemper's case file extensively, even going back as far as when mental health professionals examined the youth after he murdered his grandparents. Dr. Fort also interviewed Kemper, and the assailant revealed to the psychiatrist details about his sexual practices, and even that Kemper practiced a demented form of cannibalism. Dr. Fort theorized that Kemper exhibited no symptoms or behavior that would classify him as a paranoid schizophrenic. Kemper was obsessed with violence and sex, craved attention, even to the point of slashing his wrists with a ballpoint pen during his trial. In fact, Kemper tried twice to kill himself during the trial. If, and only if, Dr. Fort emphatically stated that if Kemper received freedom again, he would definitely kill the same sort of victims as he had in 1972 and 1973. One defense psychiatrist testified that Kemper was insane based on the product standard, which allowed for someone to say that the crime is the product of a diseased mind, but this was not within the state's definition. During the trial, not one witness produced by the defense could sway the jury that Kemper actually was insane. A little aberrant, but not insane. On November 1st, 1973, Edmund Kemper took the stand in his own defense. He tried to convince the jury that his need to possess a woman and the practice of necrophilia meant that he did exhibit symptoms of insanity. Kemper also testified that he felt some remorse for the killings, but that he took to drinking more alcohol, and that may have contributed to his carefree attitude when it came to the murders he committed. But Kemper also described the sexual ecstasy he experienced when he removed the victims' heads. Killing appeared to be a narcotic to this merciless killer. The defendant tried to emphasize on the stand that he had two personalities, one which was normal and the other of a killer personality when activated. After a 3-week trial on November 8, 1973, the 6-man, 6-woman jury deliberated for over 5 hours before finding Kemper sane and guilty of 8 counts of first-degree murder. The whole time, when Kemper believed the jury would find him guilty, he hoped for a sentence of death. But in late 1973, the U.S. Supreme Court placed a moratorium on the death sentence and therefore received 8 consecutive life sentences. The death penalty became applicable only to crimes committed after January 1, 1974. When the judge asked Ed Kemper what he thought his punishment should be at the time, Kemper responded that he should be tortured to death. The judge obviously would not grant such a draconian request. Instead, the jurist sent Kemper first to the California Medical Facility State Prison at Vacaville, California, north of San Francisco for observation, but later transferred to the California State Prison at Folsom. During his early incarceration, Kemper requested that some sort of psychosurgery be performed on his brain to alleviate any violent or aggressive sexual urges. Of course, this request was denied by prison authorities, believing that then, post-surgery, Kemper would petition the courts for his release back into society. When he arrived at Folsom, Kemper became the model prisoner by reading books on tape for the blind. But when he went before the parole board for the first hearing, he told the board that he did not believe himself fit to be released back into society. Thereafter, prison officials reported that Kemper was kind, cooperative, and gentle, but that he did not want to forget what he had done in the past. Kemper also granted requests to people who interviewed him, although later he became agitated at what some interviewers said about him. In the early years of the Behavioral Sciences Unit of the FBI, agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas sought to understand why serial and mass killers committed the crimes in the manners in which they did. They also sought to discover how these assailants planned and executed their assaults, what they thought about after they committed the offenses, what types of fantasies drove them to these acts, and what they thought in between the attacks. Edmund Kemper was one of 36 inmates with serious offenses, such as serial murder, who agreed to be interviewed by the agents. Robert Ressler began his series with Kemper in accompanying Douglas and other agents twice before his solitary interview with Kemper. Ressler believed that in previous interviews he established a rapport with Kemper and therefore had nothing to fear from the giant murderer. On their third interview, Ressler sensed something amiss and pressed the button in the small cell near death row in Folsom where he had spoke to Kemper. When he pressed the button, nothing happened. No guard appeared. From that point forward, Ressler had to mentally spar with Kemper in order to buy some time. Kemper then stated, "If I went in here, you'd be in a lot of trouble, wouldn't you? I could screw your head off and place it on the table to greet the guard." After the guard finally made it to the cell, Ressler walked out, unscathed and relieved. Kemper later stated that he was just joking. Ressler never interviewed Kemper alone again. Ressler and Douglas's assessment of Kemper was that he was one of the most intelligent inmates they interviewed. At first, Kemper appeared aloof and often played word games with them. But then realizing that all the agents wanted to accomplish was to understand how he quote-unquote ticked, he then became very open with them. Open, at least until the agents began questioning the serial killer about his mother and her treatment of him. Kemper claimed that his mother made him sleep in a windowless basement, damp, dark, and isolated, because Kemper looked like his father, or so the murderer believed. His mother took her frustrations out on him. Furthermore, Clarnell made him sleep in the basement because of her fear that Kemper would molest his sisters. The interviewee believed that at this time his hatred of women festered and grew as his mother made him feel dangerous and shameful, so he killed the 2 family cats. Because Kemper became very studious in prison, Douglas pointed out that he knew all the psychological buzzwords when he described his behavior. As a result of these interviews with Kemper and others, the Behavioral Sciences Unit matured, and therefore our understanding of what can be called murder psychology is an integral element in determining when a killer may strike, victimology, and the meanings behind their behavior, and how they treat their victims.
The case of Ed Kemper serves as an example of the abhorrent, depraved, deviant, and destructive behavior serial killers utilize in destroying other lives. This destruction does not occur to themselves, but rather to those around them that they choose to serve their urges. In viewing the work of Robert Ressler and John Douglas, certainly pioneers within their fields, one has to ask the question, when will there be a determinative factor as to whether your baseball coach, hairdresser, lawyer, or even police officer will succumb to their whims and wreak havoc on a particular type of victim? The answer to that query seems complex, but when we examine the upbringing and childhoods of such fiendish assailants as Richard Speck, Theodore Bundy, or in this case, Ed Kemper, we then realize that if licenses were issued for child rearing, the parents of the aforementioned would have theirs revoked a long time ago. It is most assuredly true that a child reflects the behavior of their caregivers, and Ed Kemper certainly characterized what we now portray as a serial killer. Will further examination of serial killers produce that magic bullet theory that allows society to halt further murders? Unless we resort to a minority report type of society, we will have to continue fumbling in our quest to predict when an individual will likely kill and kill again. Until next time.